Hey there, it's Luke from Yoda One. I recently had a very interesting conversation with David RB. Now, his background is more in animation. He has a very successful YouTube channel that focuses on short cinematic animations and gained a lot of success that way, but recently turned to developing games. He's working on his very first, well, actually, it's his second, but his first big game, a first person shooter called Arcadian Rift. He's building that in Unreal Engine, and he's mostly doing it on his own. If you see the gameplay of this game, you might find that hard to believe. But he's doing that on his own for some very interesting reasons. And I found the conversation really enlightening about how to actually go about beginning to learn the skills of developing games, how to build story, how to collaborate, when to collaborate. We talked about a lot of interesting stuff. So without further delay, let's get into my conversation with David RB. David, you've built this great game, and you've done a lot of it yourself. But I'm curious how the YouTube project and building the game come together. I mean, was that something in the plan from the beginning? I'm going to do this and I'm going to document it along the way, or did that sort of pop out organically?
No, absolutely happened from the start. I did a lot of YouTube prior. I actually was a YouTuber prior to doing game design. I did YouTube stuff as my main job for like almost 10 years. It was a long time. I did YouTube, and then there's a point where I was kind of like, okay, YouTube's fun and it's doing well, but I'd rather something like games was just more interesting to me. It was the kind of thing my friends and I wanted to do.
Hmm.
So it was always the plan. I already had the channel, and I think that's a little misleading. People see the channel like, wow, you got 200,000 subscribers, but maybe like 10,000 of those are actually from what I'm doing now, and a lot of
Right.
them are actually previously from who've been following my previous work.
Oh, right. I see. I see. Well, you also have the other channel as well, right? Making the Minecraft videos.
Yeah, I don't actively work with that anymore, but
Hmm.
it's still there, and that's why I'm also in a weird case for new developers, which is it's a little misleading when I show like, oh wow, look how much I did in a year. It's my first indie game, but I'm only able to do that because I have revenue coming in from my previous stuff on YouTube.
Well, that's not
Which,
necessarily misleading. It's just a little boost that you have. I mean, if you have resources to start a project, that's just an advantage, right?
yeah, well, it's good for me, but then I definitely I guess what I was trying to say is that I understand why some people just don't have this opportunity that I have. A lot of people they work a job, they go to school and classes, and they still get indie stuff done. And to me, that's even more impressive. I see a lot of people that they make a game, and it's like you hear the story behind how they made it. And it's like, oh yeah, I have a family, I have kids, I have stuff, and I don't have any of those distractions. So for me, I'm able to just like all day, every day, kind of work on these things.
Well, I do want to hear a little bit more about how you got into it, but maybe since just to sort of grab onto that for a second, did that inform the style of game? Because you're talking about people who have families, who are busy, who are maybe starting their first indie games. What a lot of people will do for their first game is because they're busy, because they have another job, they'll start with a hyper casual mobile game because it's much easier to do, a puzzle game or something, then start building revenue, and then their dream is to get to an FPS game, for example. Then that's what they want to do, but they can't because it's so labor intensive.
For me, I think the end goal is very much a lot of people's end goal. Like you play like Halo, you play Bioshock, you play these games, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I want to make something like that. I want to have some big story game that you can play. For me, the goal is to do something like a co-op game, something we can play with friends. I play a lot of games with. I have the same kind of like circle of friends. We always play like new co-op games, survival games come out. I don't know if you're familiar with Deep Rock Galactic was one we played. That kind of
Hmm.
thing where it's like four players get together, they go play these games, and the goal is always to make something like that, something where I can make a game and then players can play it together, make friends, work together, and kind of build these like cooperative experiences. So for me, yeah, I could have done different things. And I had done a long time ago back in college, I made a 2D game. I made a 2D
Hmm.
just kind of side scrolling thing. And I was considering doing something like that again here. But I was like, if I'm going to be spending any time making a game, it's going to take a long time to make a game regardless of what I make. People always think like, oh, I'll make a quick game. Even if you think you're going to make a small game, 6 months, 12 months
For
later, you're
sure.
still working on it. So I was like, if I'm going to spend all that time, I want to at least do something where I think what I'm doing here will help me learn the stuff that's going to help for my next kind of overall goal of making these like co-op first person games. So everything I learn here, like all the first person movements and mechanics, and like even learning the way like when you tilt the stick, like the gun leans a little bit, all that stuff is directly going to be useful when I go to make the next step or the next game.
It's very impressive. I mean, for those watching, if you haven't checked out David's videos, it's you're doing some really impressive stuff. I would recommend, at the very least, watching the 365 days video to show the whole progress of everything that you've done. Is it going to be for the co-op stuff? And maybe we can get more into it later. Is it going to be an extension of Arcadian Rift, or is it more like a completely different project, not
No,
connected at all?
that'll be a completely new thing. For this one, for my very first game, I for sure didn't want to add another layer of just complexity when I'm trying to learn everything else.
Right.
So for this first game, I was just trying to learn like, okay, how do I use Unreal Engine? How do I publish a game? How do I, do all these little different tasks and stuff? So this game is kind of my learning experience, and then from this game, I want to then see if I can like bring on a little bit of a team, bring on someone who can help with multiplayer, bring on
Right.
some artists, and then try to make like the co-op games. From what I've understood, it's not as easy to just like add multiplayer. And I know a lot of people have been asking in the comments. They're like, "Oh, can you add multiplayer to this game?" But even technicality aside, um, I'm a strong believer in someone who studies and is interested in co-op games. Is that the games kind of have to be designed for co-op. A
Hmm.
lot of games that you may have played where it's like it's multiplayer games, but it's not really co-op. It's everyone's just kind of like doing their own thing.
Right.
Whereas when you play a really good co-op game, it's like everyone's working together. They kind of have these like synergy where it's like, oh, you throw down the shield and I take cover behind it, and this person back there like gives cover fire while someone else like heals me or something. You get that kind of like cooperative experience. Whereas this game was never really designed to have any of that.
Well, I mean, it's quite impressive that it came out of learning it for the first time. So, had you never used Unreal Engine before you started building it, or did you have nothing?
Unless you count like just a few months prior,
Right.
which was me learning it, but learning it to then make this game. I had used Unity, like I mentioned, back in college. There was one of the classes I took. We had to make some like interactive thing, which was basically ended up everyone just did a game basically. So I made a game back then, but it was a very small game. It was more of just like an assignment, and there's a few other people on the project. So then when I was re kind of becoming interested in games again, I was like, okay, I could use Unity, and I tried Unity, and that was the one I was a little familiar with. But then I also tried
Right.
Unreal, and for some reason, Unreal just clicked to me. So over about 4 or 5 months, I started kind of just trying things, playing around, making these kind of like little test projects where I just goof around. And then it was after a few months of that where I was kind of like, okay, I'm kind of confident to at least
Right.
start something and then start building. You mentioned the 365-day video. The other one I did kind of similar to that was I did my first year of games development. That video really talks about how I had these first few months where I wasn't really making anything specific, but I was just prioritizing learning. How can I
Right.
learn the engine? How can I learn like the blueprint? How can I learn? And then I just focused on learning, and then I moved into making the actual game.
What was the genesis of the decision to do that, though? I know you made a side scroller game before going from YouTube. I mean, why not something else? Was it just an interest in games, or was there a business consideration? Is it a passion project purely?
Um, it was just interesting games. If anything, this was actually a weird decision for me because the YouTube channel was doing very well. The channel is doing really well. We're up to almost 10 million subscribers now. Like it's a
Yeah.
huge channel. It's very successful. It's very well, but there was a point where I was like, the YouTube was never really the goal. It just kind of happened. Like it was stuff I did back in
Yeah.
middle school. I started in middle school. I had an Xbox. I'm like, I'm going to film these things and put them on YouTube, and then it just did better and better, and it was cool. But it was like I would think of like, okay, well, 4 years from now, 10 years from now, do I really want to be doing just
Right.
these YouTube videos? Well, I do enjoy it. I certainly enjoyed it very much, but I like the idea of making these like I want to make something that players can interact with, and I think I didn't quite have that experience when making. It was more like I made cinematic stuff like short films and kind of multimedia film kind of stuff, these machinimas and animation kind of things.
Right.
And while that's very cool, you spend like a year on it, release it, they watch it, and that's it. And it's over. Like the players or viewers experience that, and then it's done. Whereas I really like the idea of what games can offer, where it's like you build a little world, once, and then players can just keep experiencing and try different things and try new things. You can add like add a new update, add some new mechanic, and suddenly players can re-experience the thing all over again in completely different ways. And so to me, that always interested me.
To what extent is there though also a relationship or maybe a feeling of community? So are there times when you're working on something and then somebody leaves a comment or a patron from your Patreon says something and you go, yeah, I'm going to add that. Is there any sort of feeling of community in the game building process itself, or is it like I built it, it's my perfect thing that I made,
Oh
here it is for the world to use? What
no,
how do you
not
how do
at
you
all.
approach it? I'm curious.
For me, it's very. I think that's what I like about this kind of age of game design. Like if you roll the clock back, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of games they were very behind doors. They just kind of happened, and then the game's
Yeah.
out, it's done.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that was good. A lot of
Triple
a
A
lot of old
model.
games. Well, yeah, but a lot of old games released, they were done, they were finished, and that was great. But nowadays, there's an opportunity to kind of make games more open. That's why I do monthly devlogs. Every month I release like my work. I read all the comments whenever a new devlog comes out. For the next at least 2 or 3 days, I'll read every single comment. If anyone has anything to say about anything I did that month, they're like, "Oh, that looked a little weird," or "Oh, that's a nice feature, but why don't you also do that?" That absolutely 100% impacts things. People have mentioned really good ideas where it'll be like, "Oh, you have this mode where you can like spend this powerful overclock to upgrade something, but you don't have any indication that like you're in that mode." I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Like someone might accidentally click that,
Right.
waste their overclock. I'm like, that's a perfect idea. I just didn't think about that, and then I'll implement that. And also I do testing every month. I have anyone who's supporting my work on Patreon at all can just play the game, and every month I let them like submit a form where they just say, hey, like what did you enjoy? What would make this game better?
That's cool.
And I'll kind of compile that list of like, okay, everyone's saying they want progression, or everyone's saying they want I don't know, like the combat feels off or something, and I'll kind of use that list to sort things and think about like, okay, what will impact the game the most at this point, which is something very cool with like early access games. I'm 50-50 on early access. Those can go very both ways. You can have
Yeah.
early access that never get finished, but you
And
can
it
also have
also
early.
can get bad press out there too as well.
Yeah, it that's been one that was I used to be very anti early access. I didn't like the idea of it, but I've seen some very good examples of how early access can be done right. And it's kind of like what you're saying with this community. Like you build a community, you work on the game with the community, and I think that can lead to some of the best games ever. Like I don't know if you're familiar with things like Subnautica and Back to Deep Rock Galactic. Both of those games were early access, and they were very much like with the community, seeing what the community wanted, what they liked, what they didn't like, and then the game was just made along that. And then by the time they release, the game's like everything players wanted. You don't have to release and
Right.
then find out, oh man, I can't believe we didn't think of these basic things that players wanted. You kind of made the game with that in mind.
Well, I mean, the other way to do it is possibly the cyberpunk way of doing it, where you kind of release it and then everyone is furious, and then you hear about that
Yeah.
stuff anyway. It gets way more publicity. So there's a good case for I think early access, and in a way, you're kind of outsourcing some of the things that an internal team would be doing anyway. A lot of
Hmm.
testing and ideation. Is that something that's coming up in the future? I mean, I was amazed going through your stuff. He's building that and he's doing that too, all by himself. This is insane. This is stuff that larger studios do. You have 10, 20 person teams doing this stuff. Is that in the works?
What was the question exactly?
I mean,
Working.
larger, like a big studio potentially,
Uh,
that sort of thing.
that's the goal for kind of like what I was saying for the next games.
Hmm.
I do have it's not entirely 100% solo. I say I'm solo developing. I'm the only one actually
Right.
like developing the game, the code. I'm the only one working in the project actively. I do have people like concept artists who submit concept art. I have a
Yeah.
person doing music and sound, and then just recently I brought someone to help with modeling. Modeling is one of those things. There's so much to be done. I had to bring someone in to help with modeling recently because there's just I got to make these levels, and I got to make these levels, and I can make those levels, and so I brought someone on with that. But yeah, no, the goal is absolutely to kind of ramp up to kind of like a small to mid-sized team. I much prefer the like smaller agile teams where it's no one's like tripping over each other's shoes. I would
Right.
never want to get so big to the point where it's like we had a long conversation with people in my Discord recently. I just recently added a feature where you can press H and the HUD goes away. There's no HUD, just
Hmm.
hides the HUD, and you can get like screenshots and it looks better. And I was talking about how a lot of games don't have that, but it was like a 2-minute feature for me. I just go in there, if press H, all the HUD turns opacity 0, done. But a lot of games don't have that, and we were talking about like kind of why that is and how I don't know the answer to this. I've never worked in a large company for games, but from what I've kind of understood is that once the teams get too large, you have this kind of like formality of, okay, I want to make this change. I have to submit like a request.
Yep.
The request has to go through. It has to get approved. Okay, well, it's not really high priority. Someone's currently working on the HUD. You can't touch the HUD right now, and then it just kind of gets like lost. An idea that would have been like a 2-minute thing to make players' lives a little better, it just can't be done. So I kind of want to stick to that like small enough where you can really like make changes. You can get feedback, the feedback, the community stuff. Um, but secondly, one of the reasons I want to do this solo is kind of, if I'm going to be like a game director directing the game, I kind of feel like I need to learn a little bit of everything,
Hmm.
not be great at everything, but I don't feel like I could direct a game well if I wasn't at least aware of different things, animation, the modeling, the lighting, the VFX, all that stuff. Because if I'm going to bring people on, I need to be able to say like, okay, maybe the lighting here is a little too, the shadow casting or whatever is different. But if I don't have any experience with that, there's almost this kind of like gap where you can't really communicate. You just say, oh, I kind of want it to look brighter. But I think by understanding a bit of everything, it's easier to kind of direct people and say, okay, that's maybe not a good decision because that's going to cause optimization problems or
Yeah.
this multiplayer thing. So I'm trying to learn just a bit of everything. Then I can bring people in and kind of help direct them a little better.
Also from a business standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to have done the entire process yourself because as teams tend to grow, and it tends to happen in any team that starts to grow, once there's a lot of specialization and nobody knows other people's specialization, then you get a lot of inefficiencies because nobody
Mm-hmm.
knows what the other person is actually doing. And so having those
That's
sort of
true.
checks and balances is good. And I work with also people who I know what they're doing because I've done it before,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes a very big difference. If you don't really know what it is, then it's a black box, and there's a lot of then bloat in the
Yeah,
project.
absolutely. Are you familiar with the T-shaped people and I-shaped people? There's a term where it's like the different people. Like if you're a specialist, you're like an I-type person. You
Hmm.
just have one thing you're really good at. But if you're someone who is like a T-shaped person, well, let's go the other way. Like you're a generalist. You're a little bit good at everything, but not great at anything. Then you're like just flat bar. But the T-shaped people, they're really good at least something. But then they're familiar with a little bit of everything. They have that kind of the breadth and the special. And what someone was talking about when they were talking about like they want to recruit those T-shaped people is that you get the overlap. Like you're saying, you don't like, oh, what's that guy working on? I have no idea.
No
Instead,
idea.
you get the
Black
T-shaped
box. Yeah.
people, and it's like, oh, that's really cool. You're doing that thing. I'm not great at that, but I'm a little familiar with that. And you can kind of have everyone can kind of work together. There's a little bit of that. Everyone can self feedback each other a little bit
Right.
without having to go straight to like, no one knows what they're doing. Then the game comes out, and then testers realize it's all off. Everyone can kind of collaborate. I guess is the word. Everyone can kind of collaborate together on the team better when everyone
Yeah,
knows a little bit of everything.
that makes sense. It's more of a mesh. Well,
Mhm.
also from the business standpoint, I'm quite curious about just where you are currently, without looking forward, and for the game that you've been working on, the sort of creative decisions that you're making. Is it more like what's cool when you're thinking of a narrative decision, when you're thinking of a game element or a mechanic decision? Is it more like what's cool, or are you also thinking about, because ultimately for a lot of games, and especially for mobile games, honestly, because the monetization of those relies on in-app purchases and ads. You need people coming back into the game. Are you also thinking
Mhm.
about engagement, retention, or is it just, oh, this is cool? I'm curious about how you approach that.
Yeah, I don't think. See, the thing is, because I'm still so new, I'm not too familiar with like. There's you listen to other talks and interviews with other game designers, people like Ken Levine. I was listening to one with Ken Levine and Todd Howard recently, and that you can tell they know their stuff. They know like game design. They know what like draws people and hooks people. They know the little things that can make people stop.
Yeah.
As someone who's new, that's really hard to like. You kind of almost learn that from experience. I think just making games and realizing like what worked and what didn't. So I don't quite have that degree of knowing exactly what will, engage people or hook people or turn people off. So for me, it is a little more just what seems fun, try it. Is it fun? Let people play it. Do they think it's fun? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure how this game will do necessarily financially, but to me, again, I'm not too worried with this game in particular, and that's another reason it's good that I'm doing it solo. Is I, if I had a team, I would feel a little more obligated. This game has to do well, like so the whole team can do well.
Right.
But for me, I'm not too worried. It's this game is a learning experience for me. I want to make something, release it, have gone through that entire process of making a game, then feel confident that I can bring on like a small team and do it again with a small team. Um, and hopefully by this game, I'll learn those kind of things you're saying, like, what are the things that hooked people? What are the things that made people stop playing the game or refund the game or something?
Right. That's an interesting way to go about it. You're sort of building it up in sedimentary layers rather than, saying, okay, I'm going to try to do it big the first time, which
Mm-hmm.
seems quite mature. But are there any big rookie mistakes that you wish you would have avoided if you're going to impart some advice, given where you are now compared to when you started, to someone who's just starting out?
Sure. Yeah. I'll kind of reiterate some of the things I mentioned in that my first year of game design stuff because that was what that video was about. I was telling people like
Right.
what I kind of learned, and there's a few things. The first thing I always tell people when they're getting started, the most important thing I find is when people first get started with anything, and even I do this, when you get like new software, it's always scary, which is a weird way of like it can't hurt you, but it's scary. And you look at it, and it's like, oh man, there's all this stuff,
Too many
and
possibilities.
this all these possibilities, but there's always this kind of fear of doing something wrong. And that's an interesting thing that I notice. Everyone kind of has this ability, this experience when you start learning this new thing. You're like, I don't want to start playing with this because I'm going to do it wrong.
Hmm.
But I always tell people like when you're first learning something, there isn't really any ways to do it wrong. Any way you do it at all is going to help. You're going to just learn something. You're just going to become more familiar. You're going to do it wrong and then learn why you did it wrong and do it better. Even if you do something kind of like, maybe not the most efficiently or maybe do some bad practices, it's really easy to you will eventually learn the right way. And it's really easy to, be like, okay, I'm never doing that again. So there's not really this the fear of doing it wrong isn't really an actual fear. So I always tell people like if you're starting something new, whether it's game designs and random software, other software, or even not software, just start like focus on learning. Focus on, okay, I'm going to make a project. I'm not going to save this project. I'm going to spend like a day on this project, and at the end of the day, I'm going to close it and not save it, and that's it. And I'm just going to like see what I can do. I'm going to see if I can make some little jumping puzzle. Okay, I got the jumping puzzle working. Can I make like the pieces move? Now I got a jumping puzzle with moving pieces. And by doing that, like every day, coming back to that, you'll start by just like a week or two later. You're like, oh man, remember when I was just doing like jumping puzzles a week
Right.
ago? Now I can do jumping puzzles where things are shooting at you and you can smack them back, and you learn a lot better that way. Um, and then the second thing, I guess,
Willingness to just jump in and swim around and figure it out,
yeah,
splash around.
you have to be able to. If you don't get past that entry point, you're not going to get started. And if you don't get started, you're never going to learn
Right.
things. You're never going to have the fun. And it's fun. It can be fun once you get past those hurdles. It's fun to start being like, the first time you get like an AI that chases you around, it's like, oh, this is amazing. These little dudes like running after me, and you only get that experience if you just jump in and start messing around.
Right.
Um, and the second part of that question about like kind of what advice I give is this is something that's really hard, and I'm not even great at this. Is you have to discipline yourself to make every single decision has to be like what is the smartest thing to do, not what's necessarily the thing I want to do the most. Because all the times like, oh, I want to add this, but you have to think about that. Like, okay, I want to add a new enemy, let's say. Okay, well, I could have this enemy. What's the enemy going to look like? Well, I could make the enemy walking, but then I have to have the feet like sync up with the floor. Then I have to deal with the feet like going
Mm.
upstairs. Or I could make the enemy floating. Then I don't have to deal with feet. I'll have to deal with legs. I can just have him hover around. And then how am I going to have him navigate? Is he going to like jump around? Well, then I got to figure out how he's going to get around. So every single thing I do, I have to think about like, what's the way I can actually do this and get it done? Because I don't have a huge team. I can't just say, oh, you guys figure out this AI. If you're making your own game, you have a small team, everything you do, you have to always be thinking about like, how can I get as close to the idea as I wanted, but make it something doable, something that I know how to do and kind of fudge it a little bit. I'm trying to think of a good example for my game where it'd be like something that I wanted, and it's like, well, I can't get exactly what I want, but if I do this thing, it'll be pretty darn close. Most people will never know, and it's a million times easier, and I can be done with it in like a day. So I always kind of think in those
That's
terms.
I think that's great advice. I think there's a human tendency to project perfect knowledge on everyone else. So you everything that's in your head gets projected onto everybody else. Like they know that I didn't do the most perfect thing that I had in my head, and they're going to see that as inferior. But I mean, most people are not going to know the difference as long as it's still good and it still works. I mean, I think
Mhm.
true for games and true for a lot of things. Sometimes you have to go with good enough rather than stopping everything because it has to be perfect.
Yeah, that brings me to some one of the terms I used to throw around, or sayings I used to say when I did animations and machinimas and the story stuff. I'd always say there'd be points where it'd be like, oh, I really want to have this scene, but the scene's not really adding much. It's a lot of work. We got to cut it. I want the scene, but we got to cut it. And we'd always feel bad about that, like, oh man, the scene's gone. They're never going to see that great scene. But then we always have to remember, and the saying goes, like, people aren't going to know what didn't happen,
Right.
if that makes sense. Like, so if you cut something, you'll be upset, but people are never going to know that that's not there. It just never happened. So players will still experience the game, and they're not going to play the game and then suddenly be like, oh man, this feature I never knew about's not here.
Yeah.
So
It sounds
yeah.
obvious, but it's worth saying for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, the way you said it, yeah, like you think everyone's going to know what
Right.
didn't happen and stuff, but they're not going to know. Unless you, the only maybe other way is if you had done like a devlog where you showed the feature in the game and then it didn't
Right.
make it. But I usually make sure like the stuff I show is stuff that got past that level of okay, it's in the game now, it's going to work. And if not, I'm always very clear. Okay, this isn't in the game anymore because. But I haven't had much stuff that I've completely cut. Most things get to a point where I'm happy with it and then they move forward, not the other way around.
I'm wondering if you've thought about other platforms. So Steam is obviously a great place to build a community. Have you thought about, now that mobile is more capable, or iPad, have you thought about other places, or is it Steam for convenience? I mean, where are you with thinking about different platforms for this game and maybe for future games?
Steam's at least the guarantee. It seems to be the kind of easiest. There's the most resources for Steam,
Mm-hmm.
so it's the easiest just to get the Steam page up as soon as possible. I definitely want to have it on Epic Games. There's a few bonuses to, like, if you work in Unreal Engine and you release on Epic Games platform. There's a few bonuses on like where they take the royalties and stuff that make it a little better. So I want to do Epic Games. I want to do Steam. Different like consoles would be nice, but it's a lot of work as an indie person. I tried having
Sure.
controller support in the game, and I did have some controller support, but there got to be a point where it was like I started realizing, oh, like it's you can't just make it like work for different buttons. You also have to make it so okay, if you open up this menu, every time it says like press E to interact, you have to change that to be okay, press right bumper to interact.
Right, and that's small
But then
stuff. Yeah.
it's small stuff, but then it adds up. Then it's like, oh, but then if I'm on
Right.
PlayStation, it's like right trigger, or maybe they call it something different, R1, I think, R1 and R2. And then if you're on, there's even differences where like if you're on 360 versus an Xbox One controller, it's like a different icon or something. So all these things added up, and even some of just the interaction is different. Like one of the other examples is like if you move your mouse, that aims your character on a PC, but then no, sorry, there's a left and right click. If you left click, that's like you're shooting, but then it's different on like on a controller. Your left click or your left stick or left trigger or whatever is different. It's things like swap around. Like your left and right trigger is different than your left and right mouse buttons. They're the other way around. So you can't just like flip them and then have it all work. It's there's a lot of just kind of weird things I picked up on that I was like, okay, maybe I'll try consoles right near the end. But and then as for mobile, I don't think the kind of games I'm wanting to do just would run on mobile very well. The kind of stuff I'm making is a little more. There's a lot of buttons. I like games with like kind of more RPGs where you have different abilities. You can shoot, you can reload, you can throw a grenade, you can do like an equipment, you can do some
Right.
like ultimate ability, and I just find it's quite difficult to pack all that into a mobile device,
Mm-hmm.
to have like to have all those controls and have it run well and have it like just all the different things you need to do for mobile. So I don't think I would necessarily deviate into that yet.
Yeah, maybe the side scroller game you built would have, but not
Yeah,
necessarily
that one
something as
actually
complex.
would have done
Yeah.
well. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that one was even designed very much to have this very like free movement. It wasn't just like WASD. It was very like you could move in any direction. So that one would have been great to like drag the character around or something. Um, probably not in the first person scenarios. I don't know if has there even been like a first person mobile game? Can you do that? I've never played one.
For sure. Have you ever played Call of Duty Mobile?
No, is
Oh,
that a
it's
thing?
amazing.
Oh
Yes.
no, I had no idea.
Call of Duty Mobile is an amazing game. I played on
Hmm.
iPad, so
Okay.
iPad has a 120 hertz refresh rate, and it has really good controller support, and the performance is amazing. Yeah,
Is it?
give it
It
a
has
try.
just like okay,
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
it's good. It's really good. I don't know. It's
Cool.
sort of like a shift, right? With mobile, what we see is a lot of people doing both. So they might do some hyper casual games for mobile, which is relatively the mechanics are quite simple for the reason that you
Hmm.
stated, because there are not as many things that you can do easily unless you want to do a lot of menu diving in a game on mobile. But and then they might do a console game or something like that. They might do both, right? But now it's starting to shift a little bit, partly because of iPad, but also on phones. I mean, there are a lot more players playing games like PUBG on mobile, and I mean that's hugely popular on mobile.
Hmm.
There are some complicated mechanics there, and they've pulled it off pretty well.
I've never been much into the mobile scene, just personally, not just on a gaming level, but even just as a person. I've never been. I'm very big like on PC. I've got my Discord. I've got all my
Right,
stuff on
right,
PC. So for me, when I'm not like on my computer gaming or working, I'm not wanting to be on my phone. I want to do anything but like electronics and these app stuff. So I've always just
right.
had like I was like the last person to get a smartphone, the last person to get a touchscreen phone, and
Oh, really?
so for me, yeah, no, when I'm off, I'm usually off, so I've never really been too much into the kind of mobile stuff, just generally.
Yeah, I mean, to each their own, I guess. I kind of dabble in everything. So I play console, I play some PC games, but I also play. I would say Call of Duty Mobile is probably maybe my favorite mobile game. It's good.
Hmm. Interesting, cool.
Um, well, I wanted to ask a little bit, if I could, about collaboration. You mentioned that you reach out to people for building models and some artwork and music. Is it more like collaborative? Is it a collaboration, or do you just hire someone for this thing? Do you have long-term collaborators? And when do you know whether you're going to collaborate or do something yourself?
I guess this game's a little weird because it started out as I'm doing everything myself other than music and sound, which a friend who's worked with me in the past for music and sound on previous projects, I knew he'd be doing music and sound, and I'd be doing as much else as I could. There comes a point where there's just things that it's almost like too much of a different field that I would have to not only learn, like I wouldn't have to just do it, but I have to learn how to do it, like concept art. That really
Right.
takes someone who knows how to draw, has drawing pads. I don't have a drawing tablet or anything. Um, so then concept art was one where I absolutely had to reach out to people. Uh, and then I guess modeling was the next big one. Then the modeling, it was one of those things where there's a point where I was like doing the math in my head. I'm like, okay, if it took me this long to make one level, and I got to do that level and that level and that level, I'm going to need someone to help with that. As far as like working with them and kind of collaborating, it was most people I'm working with are people I knew from my previous stuff. I had kind of been familiar with them when I did the other stuff on YouTube, so I kind of used that to a little bit of like, okay, well if they're already fans of my previous stuff, they're probably more likely to be interested in the actual stuff I'm doing,
Right.
which is another reason I'm doing this game, which is like I think it's gonna be easier to make my second game and recruit for it because I can be like, oh, were you a fan of my last game? Do you want to
Right.
work on another game like this but multiplayer? Whereas it's hard to find some people who applied for the modeling were very good, like very talented stuff. But I would look at the application and be like, man, I can't tell if you're just doing this as a job, you just want to kind of do a job, be it done, or if you're like genuinely kind of interested in the project stuff I'm doing. So most people I'm working with are people who I was a little familiar with previously, and that kind of helped me realize that they're going to be around a little more interested.
So, so Arcadian Rift is, among other things, a barrier to entry for future hires of the studio.
It's a big marketing recruitment. Say, hey, that game's cool, right? You saw that game. You want to make more?
Yeah, right.
Sort of. I mean, but that's how, at least in my experience, that's like every game company I might want to work for. the only reason I would have known about them is because they'd make one game I played that was really fun.
Right.
It's like, oh, I played this game, that was amazing. Are they hiring? So I kind of need that thing. I want a thing that's there, and I can prove that, like, okay, I can make a game. I've done it. Now, do you want to help on the next one? Um, so that's kind of what it's for, I guess. It's part
Yeah,
of the
no,
part
that,
of the
that
plan.
makes that makes total sense. I mean, that's the last mile, which is very hard to quantify when it comes to building teams, which is, yeah, there are lots of people with all the skill sets that you need, but how do you find that, whatever it is, the click with the team, the
Hmm.
culture, and all of that stuff? How do you build that up except by having some sort of, not necessarily a barrier to entry, but something which allows you to see that this is the right kind of person, right? I think
Yeah.
I read somewhere that um, when Elon Musk does his interviews with people, he just says, just tell me your story, and he just listens to them half for the kind of person that they are and the way they tell the story, which is an interesting approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I do any recruitment, even back, I did a lot of like voice acting recruitment and other stuff back when I did YouTube. And I always tell people always like were very professional. They give me like their CV, and they tell me what their GPA was and their stuff. And I'm always telling, like, that stuff doesn't matter to me. Like, I want to see who you are. Like, are you a
Right.
person who's pleasant to be around? Are you someone who's like ambitious, and also just like, I want to see that they're a person. I
Right.
much prefer the people that are like a little more personal and a little more casual. People who are very like, here is my CV attached. Thank you for reading and have a
Yeah.
nice day. Like, to
No.
me, that's actually kind of like I'm not as interested in that. Whereas if someone's like a little more like, hey, it's good to hear from you. I was a fan of your game. Me and my friends used to play this back in my dorm, and it was like, it was cool. We wanted to make something like this. Those kind of things. Like, to me, I'm like, oh, we have something we can already talk about. If I work with you, we might have a conversation about this, and it kind of leads in. Um, so yeah, so having this first game could be that kind of thing that people are like, that like you said, like they tell the story or something, and you're like, okay, now we got something to kind of work off.
Well, we'll have to cut this part out of the episode then once you get into hiring, so that people can't scam the
Oh
system.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. They'll make up fake
you've
stories or
you've
something. Yeah.
spilled the beans, I'm afraid.
No, I've told people this before. With some voice actors of mine, we did a thing. We said the same thing because with voice actors, it's the funny example I give with voice actors is when some people voice act, they're very much, they read the line and then that's it, and then they cut out all the mistakes. Whereas I was telling people that I actually prefer the voice actors who leave the mistakes in, the little bloopers and the outtakes, because it makes them more human. It's more fun. It's more personal. And a lot of times those bloopers, those little outtakes, I'll combine those up and then like animate the little outtakes, make a little video, and then they end up being hugely successful. People enjoy
Right.
hearing
Yeah.
all like, oh, it's great hearing this main character who's so serious in the movie, and now he's like, oh god damn it, he's like messing up and being weird. And that kind of stuff is great. So I'm always looking for people who are just people being people rather than trying to like elevate themselves to some kind of like very professionalness, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Having that sense of play and not needing to be an absolute perfectionist, because ultimately the stuff that we don't do intentionally can sometimes bring out happy accidents that
Absolutely.
that's like the story of Pixar, pretty much, right?
Hmm.
I was just as a small anecdote, I was listening to an audiobook recently on Audible, and it was pretty serious philosophy of Wittgenstein, very serious, heavy stuff. And
Hmm.
then the lady who was doing the recording, they must have not cut it out. So she says the sentence, and then she says, "Oh crap." And it's right at the end of a very serious part, and they left it in the book. But to me, that
That's funny.
enhanced the experience of the book, of having
Yeah.
this lady have a moment of humanity after all this dry, boring stuff.
Hmm. That's
Um,
what in all my devlogs I do the same thing. Like if I'm recording and I fumble words all the time in my devlogs, and a lot of people would edit it out, but my style has just been leave it in. It's funny.
yeah,
People watching this devlog and they're expecting like, okay, learn about this game, and I'll just mess up like, oh, I said it all wrong, and they get a laugh about it, and it's entertaining.
I think it adds a level of, it made me feel watching your videos kind of relaxed, like, oh, this is a person I can connect to, instead of this, because you're already slightly intimidating because of your building caves by yourself. That's already kind of like scary. that to know that you're a fallible human being is nice. Last question. What,
Sure.
I know you got the uh, hopes of the co-op stuff coming up, but right now, what is the stuff that you're most excited about?
The story, for sure. I'm getting ever so closer to really starting to work on the story for the game, and that's one thing I haven't touched gameplay wise and programming. I haven't touched, which is because I don't want to like make any story bits and then if something like the level changes or something that can really mess up everything with the story. So I can't really do the story until I'm 100% sure, have all the game in, have the levels exactly like even if I change the metrics, like if I want to have this character jump up on a crate and then later decide, oh, this crate's too close, I need to push it back, and then they jump up and they're floating. So
Right.
I haven't been able to touch any story yet, but I'm getting close to where I finally start working on the story. And for me, that's if I had like two main passions overall with games, which is anything I do. Story was one of the big ones. I love story and storytelling, and I want to make sure the story is very interesting and very hooks people and kind of intrigues people. And then the co-op is a little more specific to games, but those two things, um, and the story is one that I can finally start getting in soon and start kind of. I want to make something that people play and like, wow, I remember this at least for the story, if nothing else. Even if the game can be good, but if the story is amazing, I think that's the thing people really remember, like these moments, these experiences they had. So I'm really excited to start doing that soon.
That's cool. Then that's kind of your bread and butter as well. I mean, that's your background is
Yeah,
creating stories. So
yeah, yeah,
that's probably the easy
absolutely.
part, right? Not the easy part,
Yeah,
but the
it's gonna be certainly interesting not only to do the story, but this will be the first time I'm doing a story that's interactive and the player can, previously it's I tell people exactly where to look. Here's the composition of the camera, where the character is going to be in the frame, whether the frame's going to be zooming in, moving out. But here, the player could just be like, looking around when the big scene's happening and stuff. So it's going to be interesting to like create an experience, but keep in mind the players can mess with it and look around and change
right.
things. But it's gonna be cool. I'm looking forward to. There's also a lot of opportunities with that I couldn't do with something more like film, where I can let the storytelling be some of the gameplay. Like even one of my favorite examples of interesting storytelling with games is when games mess with like the controls in interesting ways. If you've ever played like Journey, near the end of Journey, you're going up the snowy mountain and suddenly it becomes really hard to move. You're holding forward on the stick, but you're like moving really slow, and that's a kind of storytelling you can only get with games. You'll never
Right.
experience that feeling of like, why is my character not moving? This game's always been so free, and I'm gliding down sand dunes, and now I'm like struggling to get through the snow, and that's this kind of strange experience with the storytelling that's absolutely like a interactive game specific thing. I think that's really exciting to me.
Yeah, that's cool. What would be one of the best stories that you've experienced in gameplay? Would it be Journey?
Bioshock Infinite for sure.
Okay.
That one, I don't know if everyone's familiar with that game. That's the kind of game that to me is just blew me out of the water as far as like you play the game. There's always like something a little off about the game. There's some things kind of this weird mystery, and as the game goes on, you start learning something like, oh my god, this whole game has been you think like the story was one thing and then you realize this whole time there's this other layer, and then you replay the game and you have a completely different experience the second time you go back and you're like this whole time there was all these like hints and you didn't realize it. That game I've played so many times, and it is the kind of cinematic narrative experience I'd like to get in a game. Although I also enjoy things like the Mass Effect games, some of the
Mm.
old Final Fantasies, like the kind of
Oh yeah,
character-based RPG stuff where you have like a team of characters and they all interact. All those old kind of team games. I love a lot of
those are
those
the
old things as
classics.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I really appreciate all of your insights and your time and sharing your background, your experience, and what you've got coming up. It's very cool, and it's been really great talking with you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Is there anything you want to recommend people do? I mean, we could put a link somewhere. Is there check out the game, or what do you where would you want to send people?
The YouTube channel would be great. Just if people are interested, I right now I just have the monthly devlog, so you can kind of follow along. Even if you're not interested in the game, that's kind of one of the reasons I do the devlogs. Even if you're not interested in like first person shooters or sci-fi or something, you might still just kind of follow along and be like, oh, that's cool. Look how he's doing that weird like
Right.
thing with the lighting or the modeling, and I also do the videos like the how I got into games. That one was a very like regardless of what kind of game you're doing, and I've even heard people say in the comments of that video, they're like, this applies to more than just games. I'm just doing something completely different than games. So I do some videos like that. And before we kind of started talking here before the podcast, I guess you and I were talking about like doing the different kinds of content, and I have these kind of general game designy things I want to do where it's just like pick a topic, start talking about it, and like start talking about this weird mechanic in games, and we'll do discussion, and people can discuss in the comments
That
and
would be
stuff.
very interesting. Yeah.
So I want to kind of get those going as well. I have a bunch of them kind of written up. I just need to start editing them. So there's a lot of stuff like that on the channel. If you're interested in just kind of general game stuff, yeah, the channel's a good place to check out.
Very cool. Well, check out the channel. And David, again, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.